Now, with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the commander of the all-Union Armies, General Ulysses S. Grant. What is this here thing?
I'm not used to getting applause south of Mason and Dixon, so I thank you all very much. They've asked me this morning to speak about the conference we had at City Point with General Sherman and Admiral Porter, and of course President Lincoln. I would like to spend just a few minutes talking about what led up to that meeting we had on the River Queen, and then I'll be happy to entertain any questions you have as long as they're not seditious. When President Lincoln asked me to come east, I was not particularly fond of that idea. Washington City was pretty much considered to be a place that was heavily watered in politics, and the best swimmers were the ones that got ahead. And I never wanted to be part of that swim meet. Nevertheless, I did come east and met President Lincoln for the first time. And we did find that as fellow Midwesterners, we had quite a bit in common. Of course, he was a good foot and a half taller than I am, but other than that, we got along quite well. When I went to survey the Army of the Potomac, in all honesty, I fully intended to relieve General Meade of command, and there was so much pomp and circumstance that I expected to see Imperial Caesar at almost any time. However, I did find that General Meade was, in fact, a very fine general officer, and I would say one of the finest that we have in the Army right now, and that he would, in fact, be very useful to me to try to get this ponderous machine called the Army of the Potomac to work the way I would like it to work. I have to say that I don't think I ever actually reached that goal of getting the Army of the Potomac to get it the way I would like it to work, but we did accomplish what President Lincoln wanted me to do. And that, of course, was to find Lee's army and defeat Lee's army. I must say that I probably underestimated General Lee a little bit, although I knew that he was a fine general. I had met him once when he was a colonel back in the Mexican War, and he was considered at that time to be one of the finest officers in the Army. And nothing he has done since that time, except fight for the Confederate States, has changed my opinion of him, or the opinion that most officers hold of him. At any rate, we met in the wilderness, as I'm sure you're all aware. And I think both sides thought they won, and both sides thought they were licked, and both sides were ready to fight again. I think we could have had General Lee that day, except that General Longstreet arrived literally in the nick of time. Rather than heading back to Washington City, which the Army of the Potomac had done after previous battles, which for the most part were unsuccessful for them. And one of the men in the ranks told me, General, we're never outfought, but we're always outgeneraled. And I assured him that I would try to mend that situation as best I could. At any rate, we did turn south, and I was surprised at the reaction of the Army when they realized that we were not, in fact, going back to Washington City, but in fact we're turning south, and that I think they felt they had a general that was going to finish this war as quickly as he could. Another encounter at Spotsylvania, and again, the Confederates beat me to the crossroads just by a few hours. Had we secured that crossroads, I think we would have had Lee's army in the open, which was my plan all along, which I never actually was able to accomplish. After Spotsylvania, General Lee set a trap for me at North Anna. I almost stepped into that trap, but fortunately at the last minute realized that it could just not be that easy, that General Lee would not leave an opening like that. If there's anything I regret so far in this war, it's Cold Harbor. There was no one to blame but myself as the senior commanding officer for the staggering casualty rate that day, and I take full responsibility for it. At this point, We have had a meeting, or I've had a meeting with General Grant in your town of Appomattox yesterday, and it seems as if the war is over, or at least this portion of the war is over. When I met with General Sherman and Admiral Porter and President Lincoln impressed upon us all that he wanted an easy peace on the South. I don't pretend to be a student of history, and I'm sure that General Sherman is not either. But in the past, civil wars, and that is what this is, have never ended well. They usually end in bloodbaths. And at all costs, President Lincoln did not want that to happen. He didn't want trials, doesn't want hangings, and told us essentially, in his own words, let them up easy. I have done that, I believe, with General Lee yesterday, and I would do it again, and I think it would have been the right thing to do, even if it had not been endorsed by the President. At that time, we thought, and the President thought, that the South was pretty much played out. President Lincoln had been reelected, so the North had sent a message that we were going to see this thing out until the very end. And I believe now with General Lee's army surrendering, and word I have is that General Sherman is hot on the heels of Joe Johnston in North Carolina, and I'm sure that our side will prevail there. And with the exception of a few armies out west, and perhaps some Confederate raiders out on the high seas, I think that the end is certainly in sight. And with President Lincoln having 3 more years to mend the nation, and again to lift the South up easy, and essentially just go home and be good citizens, I think that we will mend. The President had used the term in his second inaugural address to bind the nation's wounds. And I think that the action that was taken here yesterday is the first step in binding those wounds and healing the scars that this terrible, terrible, terrible war has inflicted upon the nation. And that's about all I have to say about City Point and what has led up to it. I would be happy to entertain any questions you have, as I said, as long as they're not seditious. I apologize for being late. I don't know if they sent you the news that Cincinnati threw a shoe, and your roads here aren't the best that I've ever traveled here in the United States. And a couple times with the muddy bottoms, I had to actually ride cross-country just to get here. So I thank you for your patience, and again, if you have questions, I will try to answer them. Yes, sir.
Can you speculate if you had not been able to go to the South, if Lee had been able to get together with Johnston, what would happen?
Well, there's a few different scenarios that might have happened. If General Lee had escaped us, and we were trying desperately to keep that from happening because we knew that he did plan to join up with Joe Johnston, and that President Davis had essentially issued orders to fight to the bitter end. Had he escaped us and joined up with Joe Johnston, we can speculate on who would have won that particular battle, but I have supreme faith in General Sherman that he would have prevailed. And at that point, then the combined armies of General Lee and General Johnston would have been caught in a vice between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Tennessee. I think it would have merely prolonged the final capitulation that the South is facing at this point. Does that answer your question, sir? Thank you. Yes, sir. That hasn't happened, sir. And if you have any information you would like to share with me about that, I would be happy to telegraph Washington City and let them know. If you have another question, sir, I would be happy to entertain it, but if you've been smoking corn silks or anything... Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm not free to reveal all of that, ma'am, because President Davis has not capitulated yet, but We spoke a little bit about life in the Midwest and how politics tend to pollute good people, and what a difficult time he has had as president. After all, he was elected president without a majority of the votes of Americans. And with his reelection, it seems to have put the copperheads back in their holes, and we will pursue the war and then pursue the peace afterwards. Yes, sir.
After your victory at Shiloh, I understand General Halleck had replaced you with himself as the commander, and may have said some disparaging things about you, and I'm wondering what you have to say with regard to General Halleck's comments.
At this point, I don't know of any disparaging comments, except that I have heard, not officially, that he was of the opinion that some of my former habits, bad habits, and I will say I've been accused of hitting the bottle too often. That certainly was not the case, and I had mentioned to my wife earlier in the war that there's no two officers I'd rather serve under than General Halleck and General McClellan. And as my chief of staff in Washington City, General Halleck has performed excellently for me. So I have no malice towards him at this point. Yes, sir.
You and President Lincoln talk about firing any of these generals?
Well, as I mentioned earlier about Washington City being heavily watered in politics, some of the generals that were better swimmers, like Ben Butler, once the election was secure, we felt we could do very well without their further services. And yes, President Lincoln and I did discuss that. Again, with politics and to keep the war Democrats in the fold, so to speak, we had to have several prominent Democrats as generals, colonels, and so on. But again, once his victory was secure, we managed to jettison most of the generals that, and don't get me wrong, we do have some very good generals who were politicians prior to the war. But we had some that were not very good generals, but we needed them for political reasons. Yes, sir.
Speaking of politics, do you have any ambition to ever run for president of the United States?
No, sir. As soon as my duty to the country is finished here, I plan to go back to Galena and ask the mayor to make a sidewalk from my house to the train station. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about the impact of Union spies on your strategy from 1864?
Union spies or Confederate spies?
Well, spies spying on the Confederates for Union.
They performed admirably. General Sheridan has I don't know if I should say this because I am still south of Mason and Dixon, but General Sheridan has essentially an elite force of 100 men who are mostly Pennsylvanians and mostly orphans. And they're all able to speak Southern, so to speak. And they have been absolutely invaluable in providing me with information, with infiltrating Confederate lines and Confederate armies, and especially the cavalry, which I'm sure you're aware the Confederate cavalry for the beginning of the war, the greater part of the war, could pretty much ride circles around our boys. And I believe right now there's no finer cavalry commander in the world than General Sheridan. And
What about non-military assets, like female spies?
until President Davis actually sees that the game is up and there is a peace treaty or whatever President Lincoln designs, I cannot comment on that, sir. We still have armies in the field, and dangerous things can still happen, and we're still trying to find President Davis. Yes, sir.
After Cold Harbor, did you expect to be released and then North and West, this is where they asked you and told you were butchered? Did that affect your decision at Petersburg and Innsbruck? You took the 100 down, smashed through them, and prevented that whole thing.
Well, I did not expect to be relieved after Cold Harbor. President Lincoln and I knew each other pretty well, and I knew what he wanted. And I admitted, and I will still admit, that Cold Harbor is nobody's fault but my own. It was poor judgment, and I lost my patience. So that, I think, answers the first part of your question. And would you tell me the second part again?
Well, initially, the Union promptly put a smash in Confederate lines, but they let up.
Had Ben Butler not been the commander at Petersburg, I'm sure that we would have had greater success than we had. As I mentioned earlier, yes, I was successful out west, and in all honesty, I was successful with smaller armies and fighting smaller armies, and essentially facing not the best that the Confederates had. I found that was quite different here in the East, and reorganized the Army to a degree that I thought would enable it to run like a smooth locomotive, but it was still balky, and I could not get all the pieces to always work exactly the way I wanted them to all the time. Once we finally broke through, which we had been trying to do for a long, long time, and I can tell you an interesting story about City Point and Siege of Petersburg. Soldiers in November kept wanting to build winter shelters, winter shelters, winter shelters, and I kept saying, no, 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 we won't need them because we're going to break through before then. And after my conference with President Lincoln and General Sherman and Admiral Porter, I arrived back to find that, in fact, winter shelters had been built without my knowledge. So I guess at that point the soldiers had a better idea of what lay ahead than I did. But once we broke through, the collapse of the Confederacy, or the collapse of Richmond was complete. Gentleman in the back?
Do you consider the press sort of assisting your efforts or hindering your efforts?
I think that I'm going to try to be diplomatic, although I'm not a diplomat or a politician. The press did not aid in any way the fortunes of the federal government during this war. On the one hand, you had Copperhead Press that kept insisting that the war was, is that your stomach, sir? They kept insisting that the war was a failure and that the South was in fact correct, and so on and so forth. You had plots to burn Detroit with the Confederates from Canada. In fact, there was a Confederate raid, I understand, into Vermont, of all places. And on the other side, you had the radical press, which is now calling for the hangings of General Lee and Confederate leaders. I think that an honest press, which I think is an impossibility, could have been an asset, but by and large, I think we would have done far better without any press at all. Yes, ma'am. He was one of the, again, as the war progressed, and merit that junior officers showed and rose through the ranks, like General McPherson, like General Sheridan, who was in the Quartermaster Corps at the beginning of the war, affects us very deeply. I did not know McPherson as well as I know General Sherman and some of the other generals in the Army. I understand that his death could have been avoided, but he refused to surrender. And a brave man. I cannot say that his loss impeded General Sherman greatly, because General Sherman has accomplished some wondrous things. At one point, word has gotten to me that the Confederates did not believe that he could even march as far as he marched, much less destroy things on the way, shall we say. And that the Southern press, and the gentleman had a question about the Northern press before, the Southern press was probably more duplicitous That's a big word I learned at West Point, by the way. Then the Northern press, in the conduct of the war. I have been told, and of course I did not read the press myself, that after General Lee was defeated at Gettysburg, Southern papers were proclaiming a grand march on Philadelphia. Also, the press in the Carolinas was telling the people that Sherman's army was just a mob that were huddled close to the seacoast waiting to be rescued by the United States Navy or getting coverage by the United States Navy. And of course, once General Sherman had moved through, they could probably see that the press had been lying to them for a long, long time, and probably about a lot of things. I know I've gone a roundabout way with your question of General McPherson, but I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir. Standing.
Should your armies have been better prepared to receive an attack at Shiloh?
I would have to say yes, but the intelligence that I received, and again, there's no one to blame but myself. The intelligence I received was that Beauregard and Polk and Joe Johnson, Albert Sidney Johnston were on their way to protect the rail links, and that's where I thought they were going and that they would not be that close. So we were surprised. We should have been better prepared. But despite the carnage, the end result was positive for us. Yes, sir.
At City Point, was there any discussion about the ultimate fate of the Confederate political leaders like Jefferson Davis and such?
Yes, there was a lot of discussion about that, and Confederate generals also. President Lincoln is of the opinion that you say you're sorry and you go home and you become a good citizen. All we can ask of our citizens is that they are honest and pay their taxes. Yes, sir.
What's some of your observations about the officers, Bill Sheridan and General Custer, and the past efforts that had something to do with this engagement over the
General Custer, well, first let me talk about General Sheridan, and as my blood pressure rises, I'll discuss General Custer. As I said earlier, I don't think that on the planet at this time there's a finer cavalry leader than General Sheridan. And along with other generals that, again, as I mentioned earlier, it took a while to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And there were some generals and some officers from the old Army who literally had outlived their usefulness. Had the war started 10 years earlier, I'm sure they would have been fine in the service. And again, to weed out some political generals, but at this point, I would match the federal cavalry, whether it's under Custer or Merritt or Sheridan, against any cavalry in the world. Now, General Custer. As you may or may not know, General Lee and I exchanged several letters over the past several days before his capitulation yesterday. And it's a delicate balance. The Southern people are somewhat different from we Northerners, and Sam Houston warned the Texans and the Confederacy about that before the war began. And there's honor involved, and there's face saving involved, and it's difficult for any nation, any culture, any people to admit defeat, that they have been bested. So we had very delicate negotiations going on via dispatch between myself and General Lee. And when General Custer demanded unconditional surrender from General Longstreet, who was an old friend of mine from West Point, probably my best friend, and I'm anxious to see him, it almost shook everything apart. And I think probably I've heard of Custer's luck, and I must say until a few days ago, I was very happy with him, but perhaps after the war he'd be best fighting Indians out west. Yes, ma'am.
Lee relied heavily on Jackson. When he was killed in 1863,
We can speculate about everything, including whether the moon is made of green cheese, but certainly, as he was known here in the East, Stonewall Jackson, he was just Thomas Jackson to me, was an outstanding general for General Lee. I understand that in the Valley, he essentially did wonders, befuddled Union forces that I would add at this time were not well led, and kept the Valley as a granary, so to speak, for the Confederate Army, and prevented Northern armies from using the Valley as a corridor to invade the South. Sheridan solved that problem for me last fall. And it's hard to say. I know that after General Jackson was killed, that General Lee reorganized his army rather than having 2 corps into 3 corps, one under General Ewell and one under General Hill and the other one under General Longstreet. All of them, from what I know and have met and talked to, are fine general officers. Whether they are up to General Jackson's standards, only God would know. Yes, sir.
After you left Cold Harbor and you managed to move your entire army across the James River, how did you keep that a secret from Lee?
Clever cavalry screening. I don't want to brag on myself, but maybe I will a little bit for you. I stole 2 marches on General Lee. That was just the second one. And you have to realize that we were and are still far better equipped, far better communications, I don't want to say far better men. Basically, the armies are made up of the same material. But we were able to fool General Lee. He's not a demigod. He's not infallible. We all make mistakes, and I've made my share, probably more so than General Lee has, or I would have ended the war a little bit earlier. But it was clever cavalry screening and maneuvers. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
I heard a rumor that the trains at Appomattox was simply taken by a pistol. Could you comment on that? I mean, it seems like just one person with a revolver would be able to stop a train.
Well, if that revolver was held to your head, ma'am, I'm sure you would comply with the owner's wishes. A lot of very strange things have happened since the breakout and our pursuit of Lee. We were fortunate to prevent the High Bridge being burned, and there we lost a very, very capable general officer, General Smith, who again had started to shine towards the end of the war. And I don't have all of the information, except I know that we did capture General Lee's supplies. When I was speaking with General Lee yesterday, he seemed to be unaware of it because he was talking about his supplies that he was getting from Lynchburg, and we already had them. I cannot tell you exactly what happened because I was not there and I have not gotten a report. Excuse my dress, I haven't seen my own baggage in 3 days. And things are happening very rapidly and very strangely. And we get sometimes conflicting telegraph reports about what's happening in the Carolinas. We have cavalry raids going on as we speak in Mississippi and Alabama. We've captured Montgomery. And many stories will come out, some true, some false, most somewhere in between. Officers and men, and I guess people in general, tend to expand their compliments and shrink their shortcomings, and sometimes it's difficult to sift through what has actually happened and what someone thinks happened and what someone didn't want to happen. But at this point, I'm confident that within a month, perhaps, all of the Confederate armies will lay down their arms. And as the President said in his inaugural, we can start to bind the nation's wounds. Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, we've gone maybe an hour, and I haven't heard you mention Secretary Stanton. What are your thoughts about whether or not
Well, as Secretary of War, okay, I think that he's done an excellent job, and in fact, he is actually my superior, as is the President. So I think he's great. There's no other Secretary of War I'd rather serve under. Yes, sir.
Yes, what about the prisoner exchanges? You've been involved with that decision a few months ago. Actually, I think 1863, you and the president sat down and discussed that. Can you tell us the warnings in that decision and what that outcome has been in your opinion?
Well, the outcome has been terrible in many, many ways. Part of, we're still, some people are still working on the assumption that a war is a gentleman's game, and that you have a few battles, you have some casualties, and then you come to a amicable decision as to how to stop that war. And this war is nothing like that at all. And part of perhaps the arcane thoughts about warfare was when you captured the enemy and you would then trade perhaps 5 colonels for 1 major general, or 2 brigades of infantry for 1 brigade of cavalry. It gets to be a bureaucratic game, and we found out that the Confederates were not honoring their paroles, so there was no sense in paroling them. Of course, you have unforeseen circumstances where then suddenly prisoner of war camps, and from what I've been told, from what I've gleaned, on both sides are overcrowded. Men are dying of disease, but I cannot allow the Confederacy to keep reinforcing itself with men that we have captured, and in all honesty, we're hoping that they would obey their paroles. In my discussion with General Lee yesterday, specifically put in the men were disqualified from taking up arms until properly paroled. At this point in the war, I don't think that's going to matter, to be honest with you. But it was senseless in the way it was being done, because I said they were not honoring the paroles. If we captured, well, let's say 5,000 men at Fort Henry or Donaldson or Vicksburg or wherever you want to mention, before they were paroled, they were fighting again for the South. And this is a different type of war than most people are used to. And I could afford to replace soldiers that I lost either through death or through wounds or through sickness or expiration of their terms of service, and General Lee could not. So we could not afford to continue to let paroled Confederates take up arms. I already got you, so let me get the people in the back. They're back there because the teacher didn't like them, okay? Or because they want to wreak havoc back there. So, yes, ma'am.
I just have a question, is that, Vice President Andrew Johnson from our area in Tennessee, and with word reached us that he's been intoxicated at the last inauguration, and I just wondered if you had an opinion of Vice President.
I do not know the man personally. Having seen inebriated people in my lifetime, I would judge that he had one too many John Barleycorns, but I don't want to judge people. Anyone? Yes, sir.
I don't exactly when it happened. I do recall you said that sometime during the war, something about the Jewish people that was rather derogatory. Would you care to comment about that circumstance and why that happened?
Well, we all say things that if we could retract it and word it better, we would like to do that. We had a problem in Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana with trading with the enemy. And it's part of the same problem that this gentleman alluded to with the parole of prisoners, in that we've got men, fighting and dying, and they're away from their homes, and trying to pursue, you know, the end to this war as quickly as they can, and right behind them there are profiteers. And I must admit to you, my own father tried to become a profiteer out of the war and tried to profit from my rank. And I stopped him. And it seemed as if many of those profiteers who were trading with the enemy, and of course trading with the enemy means that now the enemy is going to have money to buy supplies, to kill the men that are fighting to try to keep this nation united. So yes, I banned many people, Jews, and my own father. Yes, sir.
I wonder at this late date if you're still concerned that the remaining Confederate troops will take to the hills and fight a guerrilla war. And separately, do you believe that, how do you believe General Lee would react if that happened? At least before the 83 and something.
Well, aside from the formal signing of terms yesterday that General Lee did, we reminisced a little bit about the Mexican War and spoke a little bit about the state of the war, politics, the nation as it is. And I understand that many of his officers, including Porter Alexander, I believe, had wanted to disband and take to the hills, and General Lee forbade it. And General Lee is a gentleman, and he's a very intelligent man, and all he wants now, and I believe he's going to address his troops, and perhaps he has already, is just go home and be good citizens. And I believe he has either said or he's planning to say that if you are as good as citizens as you have been soldiers, you know, we'll all be better off for it, something along those lines. If that happens, and in fact Joe Johnston's army or Morgan's army does take to the hills, I can only foresee terrible, terrible years ahead of us. I'm old enough to remember Kansas and Missouri, and well, I'm sure you saw the term in the papers, Bloody Kansas, and I believe that would be the fate of the mountainous areas and the swampy areas in the South. Bloodshed, reprisals, and we've had plenty of them with guerrillas, Quantrill's raiders and other Confederate raiders in the South. So I sincerely hope that Joe Johnston and General Morgan will impress upon their men to go home and become good citizens. From what I understand, and I think I mentioned this earlier, President Davis is still insisting that the fight go on and, if necessary, take to the hills. I hope that when General Sherman corners Joe Johnston, Johnson has, and I believe he does, because he is a gentleman cut from the same cloth as General Lee, that it's over, go home. Yes, sir. I'll get to you next.
What are your thoughts about General McClellan? The article was written at the end that you won a war with his army. And is it true when you tried to enlist at the beginning of the war that this was you and Trump because you fought the city?
That is true, sir. I wish him no ill. He ran for president. He lost. He may yet run again. As a general, he was a very good organizer. I do not rely on the Pinkertons at all, because I find out that they're probably good detectives, but they're not good spies. At one point, I know President Lincoln said to him when General McClellan gave an estimate of the strength of Lee's army that there must not be anybody left in the South. They're all in Lee's army. And President Lincoln is full of country wisdom, or Midwest wisdom. That's, I think, why we get along so well. As a general, I think he was too concerned about losing his army, or he loved his army, and the men of the Army of the Potomac loved him, truly and truly. In fact, I've been told by General Meade that on the march to Gettysburg, the 6th Corps especially, which was farthest away from Gettysburg, and again, I'm not a historian, but I believe the Sixth Corps' march to Gettysburg will go down as one of the epic marches in military history. To keep the men moving, they spread rumors that Little Mac was back, and the soldiers responded to that. So he had something, but he was also missing something. And I wish him nothing but the best in civilian life. I think he will be very successful in politics. Yes.
Part of my understanding with the parole was the fact that colored troops weren't even accepted as prisoners
Yes.
of war.
I didn't mention that. You're correct. Continue. I'm sorry.
What has been your experience with the colored troops?
A black body can stop a bullet as well as a white body can. And any of the United States colored troops that I have seen are fine, fine soldiers. One of the tragedies of Petersburg, and I'll tell you this openly, the black troops were prepared and high-spirited and ready to perform what they had enlisted to perform, that is to break the backs of the Confederacy and the people that had mistreated them for generations and generations. So when the mine exploded to create that crater, black troops were supposed to lead the charge through, and they were more than ready, willing, and able. And then it was pointed out to me that if in fact it was a failure, the press would accuse me of using black troops to be led to slaughter rather than white troops. So at the last minute, I changed the orders, and the colonel that was supposed to lead the white troops proceeded to get himself drunk. He did not know his assignment or care about his assignment, and it was a stupendous failure. But again, going back to prisoner exchanges, and one of the reasons they were stopped was, yes, black troops that were captured were sometimes executed summarily, from what I understand, or were put back into bondage, but it would not be exchanged as white troops would be. And we cannot, as a military man, a soldier in the ranks is a soldier in the ranks. And if you can do for a white soldier, you have to do the same for a black soldier. And if the other side will not parole them or summarily execute them, we cannot condone that at all, and we have to stop it altogether. And that was also another part of the cessation of prisoners, and I'm glad you brought that up. I had neglected it. Yes, sir.
At what point in your planning for the overland campaign did you anticipate having to cross the James? And did your estimation of General Butler's military ability have anything to do with it?
I expected to cross the James fairly rapidly. As I said, had we gotten to Spotsylvania before Lee had, and I understand, again, since yesterday, a lot of my officers and officers in the Federal Army and the Confederate Army have fraternized. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing Pete Longstreet very, very much. General Longstreet had been wounded, similar to the way General Jackson was killed. And command then passed to General Anderson. General Lee's orders to him were to bivouac for the night and march to Spotsylvania in the morning. Had General Anderson obeyed General Lee's orders, we would have been to Spotsylvania before them, but he could not find what he thought a suitable spot to bivouac his corps, so he marched them through the night to Spotsylvania. Hence, they were there before we were. Although we did have a cavalry presence there, they couldn't keep the crossroads from falling into Confederate infantry hands. So I anticipated crossing the James much earlier. And again, as far as General Butler goes, as I mentioned earlier, he was useful until the elections of 1864. Okay. So that I do not incur the wrath of perhaps what may be some unreconstructed Confederates here. Why don't you pick the person that gets the last question?
What did you think of Pickett and Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, please? Would you make this stuff unknown? Was that a tragedy? Was that a good loss? Was that a stupidity?
All of the above.
Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, this is a war unlike any war that anybody has ever fought before. We can kill men far faster and in greater numbers than anyone could ever have imagined in the Mexican War or in the Crimean War. And I myself am guilty of frontal assaults. Again, I said if I could take anything back, it would be the assault at Cold Harbor. Did they work at certain points in this war? Yes. But I think that in the future that will not be the case. I've seen terrible, terrible things that I was never taught at West Point or ever even imagined could happen during this war. And it is so terrible that perhaps people will refrain from war in the future to settle the differences. I would hope so.
Question about Virginia.
Yes, sir.
What was your first experience with General George Thomas?
Old Pap?
And what was your opinion of that?
I have a very high opinion of him as an officer, as a general officer. He had smashing success in the West. My only complaint would be that when I wanted him to make his final move, it took him longer than I anticipated it would, and I was becoming exasperated with him. And again, I did have Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln becoming very impatient with his slowness in preparing for the final assault in Tennessee. And once he unleashed it, though, that was the end of the Confederate Army under John Bell Hood. He's a fine officer, and a Virginian, I might add. You're welcome.
Folks, join me in thanking General Grant for stopping by.